We'll now proceed with the late debate. The topic for the late debate this evening, as submitted by the honourable member for Dartmouth South, is therefore be it resolved that the Government of Nova Scotia put into immediate effect a moratorium on police street checks during the Human Rights Commission review of the practice. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to everyone who is staying to hear this important debate. I'm very happy that my colleague from Dartmouth South has put forward this resolution. Mr. Speaker, during question period on March 21st, my colleague, the member from Dartmouth South, asked the Minister of Justice why he won't put a moratorium on street checks immediately, pending the outcome of the Human Rights Commission. The Minister responded vaguely about waiting for evidence to make evidence-based decision-making. I think this is an inadequate response, and we all need to talk about it, and now. I hope this resolution will be an opportunity for the governing party to reconsider its response and acknowledge that if there is any lack of evidence, it is a lack of evidence that street checks are justified. I would like to think that in the absence of evidence, government should default to protecting civil liberties rather than default to infringing upon them. When the minister talks about evidence-based decision-making, it begs the question of whose evidence we are listening to, because we have an abundance of evidence from some of our most vulnerable communities that this practice is wrong. And if this government needs to have that evidence corroborated, we only need to look around us to see that other jurisdictions are already taking action. I appreciate that study and consultation can make sure that we have solutions that are specific to Nova Scotia, but there is no reason that something that is known to be harmful and discriminatory to Nova Scotians should continue while that study continues. A petition being circulated by the Working While Black organization says that the discriminatory impact of street checks on Black Nova Scotians causes psychological trauma, perpetuates negative correlations between criminality and race, decreases trust in the judicial system, and disempowers Black communities to live safely and free of racism. Every day that street checks continue, this government is perpetuating those harmful impacts. Last fall, journalist Julia Simone Reckers wrote, "Over and over again, racialized communities are asked to chronicle the dehumanizing violence they face every day. Over and over again, they oblige, but nothing changes. Why can't we hear them?" I think it's an important question to ask ourselves. The discriminatory impact of street checks has been a known issue for at least 15 years. During that time, all parties in this House have been in government and have failed to address it. So we all bear responsibility. And I think that's very important to acknowledge. So I would like to use this opportunity to share some of the voices that this government doesn't seem to be able to hear on this issue. And I want to urge this government that just because there has been inaction in the past, it doesn't justify inaction now. I want to be clear that to define what we are actually talking about. We are not talking about police being able to have friendly conversations in the community with a resident, as sometimes has been suggested that street checks entail. What we are actually talking about is police arbitrarily stopping individuals on foot or in their car without reasonable suspicion of a specific crime, and then creating a police record of that person. And that is a very important part of this, creating a police record of that person and that conversation who has not been charged with anything, and then that record being shared among police forces and even as far as the Canadian Border Services Agency. Black community activists in Nova Scotia, across the country and across the continent, have turned up the volume on systemically racist policies and practices, and we need to hear their voices. We cannot allow them to be misclassified as noise. So, It was about 15 years ago that boxer Kirk Johnson brought and won a human rights case against the Halifax police because of a street check. That court case forced the police to begin collecting statistics on street checks. They collected it, but they didn't analyze it. They just sat on it. And then it took a Media Freedom of Information Act to reveal that Black Nova Scotians are 3 times more likely to be street checked than white people. That same discriminatory impact was found in RCMP street checks. Sylvia Paris, who is an African Nova Scotian representative on Halifax's Board of Police Commissioners, has called for an immediate moratorium on street checks. The United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent toured Canada and stopped in Halifax and recommended ending carding and street checks. Lana McLean, a social worker, describes how her nephew was stopped by police biking down North Street on his way home from school. She talked about how early exposure to police sets up a dynamic of mistrust and makes Black Nova Scotians feel like they're criminals. Ishmael Beals reports that he is pulled over at least once a month. A community member named Tom, who preferred not to share his last name, talks about being harassed and followed by police when bringing his groceries home. He said, maybe it's the organic bananas I buy. Desmond Cole, journalist and activist who is a leading voice on street checks and carding in Ontario, has visited Halifax, and he sees that the practice is the same here. He says it's illegal and it's wrong. The lack of action from government reminds Black people that our government doesn't believe we belong in our streets, that the government doesn't believe we have the right to drive a car, and that we have the right for our children to walk to and from school without being harassed by police officers and asking personal questions about ourselves. Marcus James, founder of 902 Man Up, helped develop recommendations for the police back in 2003 that still haven't been implemented. He talks about being questioned by police on repeated occasions when he is closing up the North End Library after community meetings. These are just a sampling of the many voices saying there is plenty of evidence that street checks need to end now. But the province's response is another inquiry to ask Black Nova Scotians yet again to take time out of their lives to publicly share their trauma and their fear, with little indication that the province is committed to any change. We need to do better, and we need to act now. The police say that these stops and records are helpful for solving crimes, but this is actually a surveillance approach to policing that is against the Constitution and the rights and freedoms that we all hold so dearly. I was pleased to hear from the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage that the government has taken action and talking about working to end systemic racism. I'm very glad that the government is talking about this. But street checks are one of the most glaring and most documented examples of systemic racism we have in Nova Scotia. Putting an immediate moratorium in place is an opportunity for this government to do the right thing. I sincerely hope it will. And I'd like to end by quoting Sergeant Robin Atwell, a Black police officer, who said, "This practice is wrong. It's not effective. End it." Thank you very much.